was just a couple of weeks ago, and I was with my husband, and we were bringing our daughter, our oldest daughter, 18 years old, her first year at university in France at Sciences Po in Nancy. Is anyone here from Sciences Po? No hands, but anyway. Oh yeah, okay, very good. Well, she was very anxious that her French wasn't good enough. She was really sad to be losing her community of friends or leaving them behind in Vienna, and we were, of course, worried about getting her the right furnishings for her room, setting up a bank account, for getting her a phone contract, and everywhere we went, she had to show her passport. We paid her tuition, and she's all set. All she has to do is work hard. But, you know, I work for refugees, and I travel around the world and visit refugees, and I can't help but to compare my life to so many others. And when I took Alessandra to her university, it got me thinking about an 18-year-old young woman I met called Esther in the Kakuma refugee camp. Esther probably woke up today to our announcement at UNHCR that there are 1 million refugees from her country now who have fled in the last few years. So she is 1 in a million. And like many of her fellow refugees, they live in the Kakuma refugee camp, a dusty camp that has 200,000 refugees like her. But it's also a camp full of talent, and you might have heard of it because of the Rio Olympics this year. And the refugee Olympic team, the first ever refugee Olympic team that had 10 athletes from different parts of the world. 5 of them came from the Kakuma camp. But this is what they fled. They fled a war that is increasingly getting worse. When she was 10 years old, 8 years ago, she fled at the time, and she described what was all around her. She said, at the time we heard guns and bombs, and this is a 10-year-old girl speaking. Everywhere she looked, people were running, people were falling down, dying, she said, every day. And her father had already died in this awful war and conflict, and her mother decided to move her because she thought we could be next. So when she arrived at the Kakuma camp, the odds, though, were against her. She had been going to primary school, but in the Kakuma camp, there are only 5 secondary schools. That means 5,700 pupils for 5 secondary schools. And of those 5,700 pupils, 1,300 are girls. So Esther's chance of getting into that secondary school was not that great. Her mother, though, said to her, Esther, you know, you've lost your dad and you've lost your home. Just please don't lose your future. And so Esther started studying like mad, and she ended up winning a place in a very coveted school that was financed privately. And she started, there you could go online, and she started researching all these professions and decided it was going to be medicine. And even more so, she figured out that there are no neurosurgeons in South Sudan, so she was going to be the first neurosurgeon of South Sudan. But will Esther have that chance? Because of, not just in Kakuma, but all around the world, refugees have a 1% chance of getting to university. And that's compared to the global average of 34% of youth who are able to move on to higher education. But Esther already beat the odds for refugees by getting this far. If you look at the statistics for primary school, only 1 in 2 refugees get a chance to go to primary, and that is compared to 91% around the world. There's a lot to say about the quality of those schools for the 91%, but still, 91% of children in the world are in primary school, but yet only 50% of refugee children. When you get to the secondary level, it gets even worse. Only 1 in 4 refugee children are in secondary school, and if you compare that to the 84% globally. So basically, with every step of their journey in education, for refugees, it continues to get harder. Yet, South Sudan gravely needs in its future a doctor like Esther. And the refugee girls around her and all refugee students need a role model like Esther as well. But I will argue this is also in the interest of us all, Esther's education. As you saw in the film, refugees' chance of getting an education is increasingly difficult. There has been incredible growth in the number of people running for their lives, a mass movement of humanity. 65 million people forcibly displaced. That is the biggest number since World War II. And of that, 21 million are refugees. And as you probably know, refugees are those who cross borders and flee to other countries, which also makes all kinds of rebuilding their lives much more difficult depending on where they are. I don't love throwing out statistics because there is this saying that says, that goes, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off, which is why I try to tell you stories to highlight the statistics. But there is one more statistic I want to tell you right now, and that is the number 20. 20 years. 20 years is now the average time in big refugee situations that refugees will spend in exile. So we have children who've actually never even seen their homelands, or children like Esther who have memories of their time back at home that were very violent and traumatizing. And yet, all refugees that I have talked to have told me they want to go home. Even those refugees who've never seen their home. I think that's one distinctive characteristic and something that I think many populist politicians will try to distort. Refugees are there involuntarily. Refugees are in exile longer than ever before. Refugees will return, and their country will need them. If they've been away for 20 years, chances are that conflict has been going on for 20 years. If you take Somalia, for example, it's been 25. What that country will need when peace comes, and hopefully peace will come, is construction, power stations, farms and factories and schools. Not only that, what that country will need is peace and reconciliation, not revenge. What that country will need are citizens returning who are pioneers and who are leaders. But will they be equipped for the challenge? This is more than just a situation of haves and have-nots. There's a lot of inequality in this world, and we talk about it a lot. But why is this particularly important for refugees? Why does my daughter Alessandra get this chance and not Esther? Why do we say to refugees, it's okay for you to have a blanket, a bucket, a tent, but nourishing your mind, developing your skills, that's way too much for a refugee to expect. And yet, there's no one hungrier for education than the refugees I meet. They do not want to surrender to the back of the line, passively waiting for handouts of their rations of food. They want to move on and rebuild their lives. I'm reminded, I was listening the other day to this show, the TED Radio Hour, which is a fantastic show. I recommend it to you if you like TED Talks. This show was about Maslow's, Abraham Maslow's pyramid, his hierarchy of human needs. I'm sure many of you studied this at one point. But this pyramid, this whole show, I mean, you can apply it to everyone in this room. I think it applies to all of us. Some people apply it to work situations, whatever. But I also see it in the frame of refugees. That first physiological need at the bottom of the pyramid is all about survival. It's about food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep. The real essentials just to live. The second level is also very critical, and that is our own safety and security, including our own economic security, being able to sustain, provide for ourselves and our families. When we move up the ladder to love and belonging, this is the feelings we get from our partners, our communities, conferences like this, from teammates or sports fans, work colleagues, religious groups, tribes, clans, all very important. But the fourth and the fifth level reminded me very much of the refugee context, because that level, the level of esteem, it's not just to be interpreted as the pursuit of fame and glory, though that might be part of it. What it is the inner confidence that you get from being independent, from being self-reliant, self-sufficient, but also in gaining and pursuing knowledge. And the fifth, which is self-actualization, that's the realization of a person's full potential to become everything they want to be. And that's what you're doing in your profession with all the students that you help. I believe that education on the top parts of those pyramid lies at the very heart of such aspirations. But then I was thinking about UNHCR's budget, which is the organization I work for, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We have what's called a needs-based budget, and you saw all the people in the world that we need to try to take care of. Well, we submit every year this budget to the governments around the world, and we say this is what needs to be funded if we are to take care of refugees. And at the bottom of that pyramid, that is really, it's always funded. Those are the tents and the blankets, the first responder, medicine, the emergency assistance. But as soon as we start moving up the ladder, when it becomes more the items that will allow refugees to rebuild their lives, especially education. Education is one of the first items to get cut off, and especially at the secondary level. We have like 1/3 of the funding that we get for primary school for secondary. And you probably, as university administrators, you understand that if you cut off that chain that leading up to university, the students are never going to get there. Additionally, cutting off secondary education risks children having to work and early marriage, or they may go adrift and become easy prey for recruitment by armed groups. And even if they are in school, probably some of these refugee schools are the world's toughest classrooms. This is what some of those classrooms look like. They lack materials, and many of probably the average time a refugee student misses out on school, has missed years of education, is 3 to 4 years. So these kids have come into the classroom and they've lost a couple of years of education. They may only have one parent at home, if any at all, because their parents have died. They may be being taught in a different language. Yet, we believe at UNHCR that refugee classrooms could and should go from the toughest classrooms in the world to the most transformative. which is why we have developed accelerated learning programs to get those kids who've missed out because of the war on years of education up to the level of their peers. This is why in the countries that host so many refugees, and I have to say that 86% of the world's refugees are in developing countries, not in Europe, as many people would have you believe. We lobby very hard for integration in national education systems because we believe this is the most effective way of integrating students, making sure they receive accredited qualifications and are taught by qualified teachers. We also, of course, campaign for funding for new and improved schools so that the schools don't look like this, but also that the kids from the host community can also upgrade their schooling experience. And also, we really campaign and push for the inclusion of refugee girls. And I just wanted to make this point because as in all over the world, girls tend to fall through the cracks. It is particularly so for refugee girls. They're often the first to drop out of school because of their circumstance, the race to find shelter or food. Their enrollment levels are very low, but the returns of putting refugee girls in school are extraordinarily high. So I, for one, truly believe that educating girls will help us to stop the cycle of violence in their home countries when they return. But I told you, and I put those statistics out to you, that there are lots and lots and way too many refugee children who are not in the classroom. And what of them? I've met many of them, and I want to introduce you to one. Her name is Ghazal, and I met her in her tent in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, which is basically the heartland of Lebanon where everything grows. But now it is the place where most refugees live, in tents, and she lives in a very muddy makeshift camp. And when she fled from Syria, initially she was going to school. But like so many refugees, and 25% of Lebanon's population is now Syrian refugees, like most refugees there, they're not allowed to work. At least the adults are not allowed to work. Unfortunately, child labor is tolerated. And because funding is so limited for humanitarian organizations like ours, families living as refugees need to do something to supplement their income. And parents are faced with this horrible choice. In order to survive, they have to pull their child out of school, like Ghazal. And when I met her, she had just returned from a 10-hour shift working in the fields picking potatoes. And her earnings that day were $4. At one point, she's smiling right now because she had just gone and retrieved something that she wanted to show me, and it was basically a pile of books. They were classroom books, notebooks that she had brought with her when they fled from Syria. And she told me that every single day after she comes back from the fields, she goes over those books. In fact, all refugee children tell me that education for them is the most important thing in their lives. And why? Because it allows them to think of hope rather than hatred. It allows them to think of their future rather than the nightmare of their past or the grueling existence that they're experiencing now as a refugee, or of the peaceful time back home when there was no war and when they were going to school. In Syria, and Syria is the conflict that is pushing and the biggest driver of displacement now today in its 6th year of this awful war. In pre-war Syria, 99% of children were in school. Now it's by estimates, and we don't know the exact figure, it's 50% of kids are not in school in Syria. And we've seen some of those schools. They're in basements. They're being run by the teachers who are not qualified. They're solar lights. So the quality is nowhere near where it was. In the neighboring countries that are hosting 5 million refugees, 900,000 Syrian refugee children are out of school. So if we are losing a generation anywhere, it is here. Which is why in this last year, in 2015, I think most of you are from Europe, we saw so many Syrian refugees moving to Europe. It had been 5 years of war, losing hope that they could ever return, living in a tent like gazelles, fathers, parents not being able to work, children not being able to go to school, and an opening in Europe where they thought, okay, even if I have to risk my life on a boat like this, crossing the Aegean Sea, at least I can reach a place where there's not just safety for me and my family, but there's also a chance for me to work and to put my kids in school. In fact, we surveyed people arriving, and many of those who were arriving were students. I remember in Austria, meeting as people were arriving, meeting a young man who had just arrived into Vienna, and he spoke fluent English to me and saw that I was somehow, thought that I knew what I was talking about. His first question to me was, how do I get on public transportation? But his second question was, can I continue my studies? Of course, there are lots of fears when refugees come in large numbers. How will we feed them? How will we house them? Who will protect them? And these feelings right now are being twisted by populist politicians, by tabloid newspapers. These people are being demonized, and they're telling us they're coming for your job, your house, your medical care, and your child's school place. But we forget that these are actually innocents. They're fleeing the violence and persecution and terrorism, the very thing that these politicians would have us fear. So how are they increasingly being greeted in Europe by the erection of fences, deals being done so that they will stay in countries closer to home? What we should really be doing beyond welcoming them if they do come is helping Esther become a doctor. We should be helping Gazel get out of the fields and into the protection of the classroom. Because not to do so, not to fund education and not to insist upon it, is not merely a tragedy for Esther or Gazel or any refugee child. It is short-sighted, it is self-defeating, and to put it frankly, it is dumb. It is a lost opportunity to educate a group of future peace builders, engineers, and civil servants. And it is the single biggest thing that we can do to stem the tide of extremism and to contribute to peace. So I believe that refugee education at all levels should be a global priority, and it should be non-negotiable. We should be helping refugees to thrive and not just survive. This is in everyone's interest. It is the refugees who should be the architects of peace, prosperity, and stability in their countries. They're the ones with the interest in doing so. We're investing so much in trying to stop the wars that are driving them, but we're not investing in the refugees who can stop the future cycle of violence. We have just issued a new report on refugee education, and I hope all of you will look it up. It's unhcr.org/missingout, and it's on the state of refugee education at all levels, primary, secondary, and university level. In it, we highlight these formidable barriers that I've been describing for the children who need it most, but also the transformative power of education in students like Esther's. So now it's been a few weeks since my daughter Alessandra has started her university, and she's gotten over her fear of speaking French, and she's found a circle of very bright and caring students. She's stretching her mind and she's challenging her intellect. Her future is in her hands, but I believe that Esther's future is in ours. And she said, I would love to return as a successful citizen, ready to make a change. She also said, I want to be the girl that made it from the camp to the campus and from refugee to neurosurgeon. There are so many casualties of war. Education should not be one of them. Thank you very much.